For the past couple of years, I have been working as a funeral director in a quiet little town. Surprisingly, I love my job. I spend hours listening to audiobooks, my boss is genuinely a great guy, and the dead do not bother me at all. They are peaceful company. They are not pushing an agenda or trying to sell me something, which is more than I can say for most of the living. There is also a strange satisfaction in what I do. Preparing people for their final journey feels like a solemn act of respect, a service to the community, and it gives my days a sense of purpose. Honestly, this was the best job I ever had. At least it was until the smiling corpses started showing up. I am not entirely sure when it began. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, but time has been feeling a little warped since all of this started. At first, it was just 1 or 2 bodies. Then the numbers began to grow, and things spiraled into something I still cannot explain. Now, to clarify, I know that sometimes the deceased can appear to have a faint smile. It is just how some people's features are naturally set. Other times, we might adjust the lips ever so slightly to give them a more familiar expression. Something softer, less stark than the lifeless face of death. But these smiles? They were nothing like that. These were wide, unsettling grins that stretched their pallid skin tight, pulling the corners of their mouths unnaturally far. It was disturbing. The first one arrived on a gloomy, rainy afternoon. Her name was Rachel, and she was only 31. That alone was unusual since most of the people I deal with are much older. She had died suddenly from a blood clot. Working with younger cases like hers is always tough for me. Before I even unzipped the bag, my mind was already picturing the family she might have left behind. Maybe young kids waiting for their mom, parents shattered by the loss of their daughter, and friends grieving a life cut short. I forced those thoughts away and got to work. I flicked on the overhead light, wheeled the stainless steel table closer, and reached for the zipper on the body bag. The moment I opened it, I froze. She was smiling. Her lips were pressed tightly together, but the corners of her mouth were sharply upturned. It was the kind of expression that does not just happen. It requires active muscle control to hold. I quickly unzipped the rest of the bag, and there was no doubt about it. She was dead. Her skin was pale as stone, her eyes were shut, and her lips had a faint bluish tint. What the hell? For a split second, I wondered if somehow she was still alive. My hands trembling, I touched her face, cold as ice. I lifted her thin wrist to check for a pulse, but there was nothing. As a professional, I knew better than to jump to conclusions. If she had died smiling, rigor mortis might have set in, freezing her face that way. But that was impossible. Rigor mortis takes time, and in the hours after death, facial muscles naturally relax into a neutral position before stiffening. This did not add up. I stood there, staring at her, my head spinning. There was no way she was alive. But how could she be grinning like that in death? Not knowing what else to do, I called my boss, Matt. When he walked in, his confusion mirrored my own. Maybe it is just a natural quirk, he suggested. Like a congenital thing. Maybe this was just her resting expression. I do not think so, I said, shaking my head. We came up with another theory. Maybe the coroner had done something. Could have been a prank, or maybe he thought he was helping us by making the bodies appear less lifeless. The guy was a little eccentric, so it was not entirely outside the realm of possibility. But even if he did that, I pointed out, a smile like this would fade after death. This type of expression, it requires active tension in the muscles. Matt had no answer for that. He went to call the coroner. When he came back, his face was grim. The coroner, Josh, said she was not smiling when he finished the autopsy. I felt a cold dread wash over me, like a bucket of ice water dumped down my back. So, the smile appeared after she was already dead? During the drive over. That is impossible, I said, my voice unsteady. I know. We made more calls to paramedics, medical examiners, and even the police, but no one had any idea what we were talking about. According to Josh, the body had been securely stored after the autopsy, and no one had tampered with it. That left me with only one explanation, as absurd as it sounded. It had to be something specific to Rachel. A rare condition, a strange phenomenon, something medical that I could not even begin to comprehend. Because what else could it be? A ghost forcing her face into a grin? A demon playing tricks with her corpse? None of it made any sense. "What do you want me to do with her?" I finally asked Matt. "Just handle her like normal," he said. "If anything else strange happens, let me know." And with that, he left me alone. After pacing the room a few times to collect myself, I returned to her body. I placed my fingers at the corners of her mouth and gently pushed downward, trying to reset her expression. Something felt off. I prodded her cheeks, puzzled. Normally, cheeks are soft, supported by bone underneath. But Rachel's felt solid, like they had some sort of internal structure I could not explain. Maybe she had some work done. Fillers or Botox. I wondered aloud, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. I kept pressing and prodding her face, but the more I explored, the stranger it felt. Something about the way her bones and muscles fit together beneath the surface was off. It did not feel natural. Finally, I called Matt back into the room. "Does her face feel weird to you?" I asked, stepping aside. He placed his fingers on her cheeks, pressing gently, and frowned. "I guess it does feel a little odd," he admitted after a moment. "Maybe she had some kind of plastic surgery?" That's what I thought. Maybe that's why her face is stuck in this weird smile. "It's possible, I guess," he said, though he did not sound convinced. With that, Matt left and I was alone with her again. I went back to the grim task of setting her features, trying to work quickly so I could be done and move on. But the longer I was alone in that cold room with her, the more uneasy I felt. My chest started to tighten. I felt lightheaded, like I could not get enough air into my lungs. My legs felt weak beneath me. Panic attack. I stepped back from the table and forced myself to take a deep breath. "Name 5 things you can see," I murmured under my breath, trying to ground myself. "Cabinets, hand sanitizer, scissors, linens, and Rachel's lifeless body." Not the best environment for calming your nerves. I had never felt this way in the morgue before. The bodies had never disturbed me. I had always been able to separate the person from the empty shell they left behind. It was just flesh, no different than the strands of hair or bits of skin we shed while alive. But this time it felt different. That grotesque grin. The feeling of her cold skin against my fingers as I worked to turn her lips downward. It gnawed at something deep inside me. I stepped away again, took a few more deep breaths, and tried to steady myself. Then I forced myself to continue. I grabbed a spool of clear thread from the cabinet and began stitching her mouth shut. We always had to do this. If we didn't, the jaw would slacken, and their mouths would hang open in a way that was deeply unsettling. One time I forgot to do it, and it was the only time Matt ever yelled at me. As I worked, I could not get her grin out of my head. My hands trembled as I passed the needle through her lips, and I could not shake the feeling that there was more resistance than usual, though I could not tell if it was real or just my imagination running wild. I finished the stitching, then moved on to her hair, combing through the dyed blonde strands and arranging them neatly. I applied a light dusting of powder to her cheeks and nose, followed by a soft, peach-colored lipstick to bring a little life back to her face. Finally, it was done. I stepped back to look at my work, and I had to admit, it looked good. Her expression was peaceful, like she was simply sleeping. I left the room to grab the earrings her family had left for her. Once they were in place, I would finally be done with Rachel, and I would not have to see that unsettling smile ever again. When I returned, I froze in the doorway. Rachel was smiling again. "Matt," I called out, my voice shaking. "Matt." I felt the ground sway beneath me, like the world had shifted sideways. My knees buckled, and I stumbled toward the wall for support. "I set her features," I said when Matt arrived. "I stitched her mouth shut, and she's smiling again." He looked at her, his face pale and slack with disbelief. For several moments he did not say a word. Finally he murmured, "I have never seen anything like this." I moved to stand beside him, staring down at her unnerving grin. One of the stitches had snapped, and a piece of clear thread dangled from her lips. Could it be Ben playing a prank? I asked desperately. I wanted so badly for that to be the explanation, for this to be some cruel joke, rather than what my mind was beginning to imagine. Ben was the youngest mortician here, barely 21 and obsessed with social media. He was always filming goofy stunts or talking about the latest TikTok trend. It would not have surprised me if he had thought this was funny. Matt shook his head. "I don't think so. He's supposed to be prepping the other body right now. But we can check the security cameras." Last summer, after a break-in, Matt had installed cameras in every room of the funeral home. As unsettling as the situation was, I felt a flicker of relief knowing we might get some answers. I followed him down the hallway, putting as much distance between myself and Rachel as possible. At the desk, Matt pulled up the footage from the morgue and hit play. We watched as I worked on Rachel in the grainy black and white video. We saw me finish, leave the room, and shut the door behind me. 1 second passed. 2. Then it happened. The corners of Rachel's mouth jerked upward, as if invisible strings had been pulled tight. "What the hell?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. That can't happen, can it?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "No," Alan said, shaking his head. There's no way that can happen. I knew dead bodies could sometimes move post-mortem. Chemical releases in nerve endings could cause twitches, and decomposition gases could shift limbs or even open mouths. Once, I'd read an article about a corpse whose arms had stretched out after weeks of decomposition. But this wasn't that. Amber had been properly stored, and this wasn't a random twitch. This was a grin. I remembered reading somewhere that smiling only took 12 muscles, while frowning required many more. But this wasn't just a fleeting expression. Amber's smile had stayed. Her 12 muscles weren't just moving. They were working together, holding the grin in place. It made no sense. Alan rewound the footage and played it back repeatedly, muttering under his breath about rigor mortis and other medical possibilities. But I couldn't bear to keep watching. Every time I saw her lips pull back into that awful grin, my stomach churned. I left the office and hurried back to the morgue, eager to be done with Amber for good. By tomorrow morning, she'd be buried, and this nightmare would be over. All I had to do was set her face one last time, load her into the refrigerated cabinet, and close the door on this unsettling chapter. When I opened the morgue door, I froze. Ben was standing over Amber's body. "Whoa," he said, glancing at me. "What did you do to this one?" "Nothing," I snapped. "She came like that." "Seriously? What's wrong with her?" "Nothing, to my knowledge. But she's smiling." "I know." He turned to look at me, confused. "I don't know what's going on," I admitted. "Neither does Alan. She just does that, and we can't figure out why." "She looks creepy as hell," he said with a grin, his hand twitching toward his pocket. "Don't even think about it," I warned. Ben's face fell, and he walked out, looking disappointed. Probably upset he couldn't use Amber for one of his stupid TikToks. As soon as he was gone, I got to work. I re-stitched her mouth shut, this time pulling the corners down into a deep frown. Maybe that was the problem before. Maybe setting her features into a smile-like neutrality wasn't enough. Sure, her family wouldn't be thrilled to see her frowning, but at this point I didn't care. Once I was finished, I slid her into the cabinet and shut the door. Relief washed over me. It's over. I'm done. But Amber was just the beginning. The following week, more smiling corpses arrived. Jasmine, 47, killed in a car accident. Eleanor, 62, who had succumbed to pancreatic cancer. John, 23, shot in a mugging gone wrong. All smiling. Alan and I contacted the police, the coroner, even the transport teams. No one reported seeing the bodies smiling before they arrived at the funeral home. We checked the police reports from the accident and mugging. Nothing about smiles. It was clear. The bodies only started smiling after death. Alan reached out to colleagues and even some local university professors. He floated theories. Contaminated tools causing allergic reactions, improper storage angles affecting facial muscles. None of it explained why the corpses resumed smiling after we set their features. I pondered all of this while working on John. His pale face was twisted into that grotesque grin, the stubble around his lips making it look even more jarring. I worked on autopilot, dragging the corners of his mouth into a deep frown and doubling the stitches for good measure. But I wasn't optimistic. Amber's smile had reappeared despite my best efforts. Her sister had called, furious, after seeing her grinning during the funeral. "Hey, Sam." Ben's voice called from across the room. "What? Can you come here for a second?" I reluctantly set down my tools and walked over to where he was working on another body, an older woman in her late 50s or early 60s. "Her file says she weighed 160 pounds, he said, gesturing to the clipboard. "But she feels way lighter than that." I grabbed her shoulders and shifted her slightly. "Ha!" I muttered. "She does feel light." To be sure, I grabbed her midsection and lifted a bit. She felt impossibly light, as though she were made of hollow plastic. "Let's weigh her again," I said. We rolled her onto the scale, and when the digital number appeared, my stomach dropped. 97 pounds. "There's no way," I whispered. "This woman can't be 97 pounds. "I know," Ben said. We both stared down at her. She was of average height and build, hardly thin enough to weigh under 100 pounds. "I'll tell Alan," Ben said finally. He turned back to his work, leaving me to finish John. I returned to the table, trying not to look at John's face. I focused on my routine motions, treating it like any other task. But as my hands moved, a chilling thought surfaced. A moment of unsettling clarity. 5 smiling corpses. If it had been just 1 or 2, maybe we could have explained it away. An allergic reaction, a rare deformity, or one of Alan's theories of the day. But 5? When this kind of phenomenon had never been reported before. There was only one explanation, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Something was infecting them. Maybe a parasite or bacteria. Something in the town's water, maybe. My mind conjured an image of a pale, wriggling leech-like creature squirming inside John's mouth, pulling his lips into that hideous smile. Then an even worse thought struck me. If I'd touched their faces, was I infected too? A surge of panic gripped me. My mouth felt itchy, or stiff, or something. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. I left John lying on the table and ran to the bathroom, scrubbing my hands over and over again under scalding water. Of course, if it were contagious, it was probably already too late. But I had to do something. When I returned to the morgue, my stomach dropped. John was grinning again. The stitches I'd painstakingly put in had snapped. A single drop of blood traced the curve of his lips like macabre lipstick. "Fuck! Fuck! Fuck!" I whispered, the world narrowing down to his grotesque expression. I couldn't stop staring at his mouth. I had to look inside. I had to make sure there was nothing slithering in there. Holding my breath, I pushed his jaw open and peered into the darkness of his throat. For a split second, I thought I saw something move. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The harsh beam illuminated the inside of his mouth, his gums, teeth, and the black void of his throat. Nothing. I shone the light around, lifting his lips and carefully inspecting every corner. Still nothing. I let out a shuddering breath and stepped back. Get a grip. Forcing myself to calm down, I re-sewed his mouth shut, even though I knew it wouldn't last. As I worked, I noticed something else odd. John had died in a mugging gone wrong. He'd been stabbed, but his pale, blue-tinged skin was flawless. No bruises, no stab wounds, nothing. Granted, he was dressed. Ben had done that earlier, so maybe the wounds were hidden beneath his clothes. But still, something didn't sit right. I'd worked on plenty of violent crime victims in my career, and none of them looked this untouched. Other than his unnatural pallor, he looked perfectly healthy. Just sleeping. I suppressed a shudder and slid him into the refrigerated cabinet, relieved to shut the door on him. A few days later, the sheriff paid us a visit. He sat in Alan's office, arms crossed, glaring at us. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop investigating this," he said plainly. "What? Why?" Alan asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "It's attracting too much attention," the sheriff replied. "WBX called me the other day. They want to run a story, asking all kinds of questions. We don't want outsiders poking around. You understand?" "With all due respect," Alan began, "this has never been documented before. One of the professors at Hawthorne wants to—" "No," the sheriff interrupted. "No studies. No investigations. Nothing. You can't stop us," Alan said firmly. The sheriff leaned forward, his tone icy. "No, I can't. But let me ask you this, Alan. Do you like lawsuits? Because if WBX runs a story about smiling corpses, you can bet the families will be looking for someone to blame. And that someone will be you." Silence hung heavy in the room. Alan looked away, his shoulders tense. "Understood," he muttered. "Good," the sheriff said, rising from his chair. He tipped his hat and left. Alan stopped investigating after that. I could see how much it pained him, but the funeral home was his livelihood. He'd turned it from a small operation into one of the largest in the county. He couldn't risk a scandal. So we stopped asking questions. But the corpses kept coming. Alan ordered industrial-strength adhesive to seal their lips. It worked better than thread. The smiles didn't return, at least not visibly. And that's how we coped with one of the most horrifying things our town had ever seen. We glued their mouths shut. 3 weeks passed since the first smiling corpse arrived. By then, we'd received 27. Alan focused solely on keeping the operation running smoothly, ordering adhesive by the gallon and avoiding any further scrutiny. But I couldn't let it go. I started my own quiet investigation, anonymous, untraceable. Internet searches, library research, anything that might give me a clue. Looking into their deaths yielded nothing unusual. So I turned to their lives. I looked for connections: age, gender, occupation, religion, ethnicity. Nothing. They were as random as a shuffled deck of cards. Then I mapped their addresses. Every victim lived within a square mile of each other. I printed out a map of the town and marked each address with a red dot. Most clustered along the west side of town, near the edge of the state park. I added the dates we'd received each body above the dots. That's when I saw the pattern and realized the horrifying truth. The first bodies, Amber's included, had come from that street. The next group had come from the neighboring streets. And the most recent ones? They were from areas furthest from the initial site. In other words, it was spreading. The nexus was that street, with the smiling corpses radiating outward, like a virus infecting the town. What the hell was going on? The last 3 victims had lived within half a mile of the funeral home. I explained all of this to Alan in his office. The doors were shut, and I kept my voice low. "It's spreading," I said, pointing to the map covered in red dots. "You're not supposed to be looking into this," he said sharply, though I could tell his frustration was more about the sheriff than me. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But now that I know this, don't you think we have to do something?" "Do what exactly? Go to the police? What could they even do about it? And it's not like this is killing people. Every single one of them had a legitimate cause of death. Cancer, heart attacks, what's next? Are you going to tell me this thing causes cancer?" He scoffed. "I don't know," I snapped. "But it's not a coincidence, Alan," He buried his face in his hands and groaned. If we tell people, it's going to cause a panic. And my business will be done for. So what? We just keep it a secret. I don't know, he muttered. I've never seen anything like this. Just give me a few days to think about it. We'll figure something out. I left his office uneasy. Alan had always been the type to do the right thing even when it hurt. I thought back to last year, when a car accident damaged a body we were transporting. He could have lied, blamed the damage on something else, but he owned up to it. We lost money, but he said it was worth it to stay honest. But now, I couldn't just leave this alone. Something terrible was happening, and it was spreading. I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, I drove to the west side of town, to the cluster of homes where the first smiling victims had lived. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Anything unusual, anything that might explain what was going on. I kept the windows up, the heat off. I didn't want to risk letting in any kind of pathogen, viruses, fungal spores, parasites. The neighborhood was affluent, full of McMansions built just last year. They were cold, sterile-looking structures, white with black trim, the dark window frames giving them a harsh, prison-like appearance. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as though the houses themselves were staring at me, their glassy eyes following the beat-up sedan creeping through their pristine streets. I kept driving, past the glowing neon of gas stations and convenience stores, until I reached the end of the street. There, at the cul-de-sac, I froze. Instead of houses, the area was cordoned off with a chain-link fence. A red sign hung from it, reading, "Keep out." I rolled the car forward for a closer look. Beyond the fence, the ground was unnaturally flat, with grass growing wild over the abandoned construction site. Two large, rectangular holes gaped in the earth, their sides rough and uneven. They'd been dug for basements, but the developers had clearly stopped before pouring any foundations. Why? This development had been in high demand. Prices skyrocketed before the last homes were even finished. If the money and interest were there, why abandon the project? Maybe they found something, I thought. Maybe they dug something up. Parasite, a virus, something ancient, buried for centuries until the digging released it. I'd read stories about climate change releasing dormant pathogens in Siberia. Who's to say something similar couldn't happen here? I wanted to get out of the car and take a closer look, but I knew better. Instead, I crept forward, letting my tires bump the curb. Then I switched on my high beams. I wished I hadn't. The dirt wall of the left hole was disturbed, the soil fresh and dark, as though something had been moving there recently. Just an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon. Maybe it fell in and was trying to scramble out. Even though I tried to believe it, my hands trembled as I shifted the car into reverse. I hit the gas and sped home. The image of that disturbed dirt burned into my mind.